In the 1950s, Americans seemed to be living in post-war bliss. But beneath its idyllic surface, the country lived in fear of a nuclear attack by the Soviet Union. Politics, culture, and daily life reflected the uncertainty and paranoia of the era.
It was a different world, and it may seem a little bit bizarre now, but people were genuinely worried about communism. They had, after all, taken over Eastern Europe, and they had killed millions of people, perhaps as many as 20 million in the Gulag. So there was a real worry about communism, and there was a real thought that maybe they could take some things over, and maybe they did have that intent.
Will there be peace or war?
U.S. Air Force nuclear bomber crews were put on constant alert. For one South Carolina family, a tense drama played out thousands of feet above them brought the Cold War far too close to home. The precarious alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union, born out of the need to defeat a common enemy, devolved into mutual distrust and suspicion immediately after World War II.
The wartime alliance was a marriage of convenience that broke down as soon as Germany capitulated. Actually, the origins of the Cold War were already visible during the last year or two of the war. Churchill and Stalin, I think, both understood that whoever army would liberate territory in Europe would control that territory and determine what kind of government would exist there. And so there was a race to gather territory at the very end of the war.
Suspicion between the two nations intensified quickly.
The high point really came in 1949 with the Chinese Revolution, and then shortly after that, the Korean War.
Though the U.S. and Soviet Union never fought directly, they were clearly enemies, and to the shock of Americans, the Soviets were heavily armed.
The Soviets surprised us with the explosion of their first atomic bomb in 1949. Our predictions had been that they would not get the atomic bomb for a good 10 years. And from 1945 to 1949, the United States had a monopoly. But all of this combined to generate in the West this intense fear.
The tense rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union influenced nearly every facet of American foreign policy.
Western leaders had this absolute assurance in their own minds that the Soviet Union was inherently aggressive and an expansionist power. And the only way to counteract that was to contain Russia with alliances, with economic programs to rebuild Europe, but most importantly, with building up in arms. In 1957, the Russians launched Sputnik.
The successful launch of Sputnik enhanced perceptions that the Soviet Union was quickly pulling out ahead of the West, and in particular, the United States. Not only did the Soviet Union have nuclear weapons, they were quickly developing a way to use them against the U.S.
The Eisenhower administration initially says that it's a hoax, but then very quickly began to realize, no, this is real. And the symbolism of it was that Russia was ahead of us in science and math and in the arms race. It scared the West, the realization that we were behind in this scientific race. And in a military sense, it meant that the Russians had launch capability for intercontinental ballistic missiles. The military in the United States recognized that we didn't have that same technology at the time.
Sputnik traumatized the West. Leaders in the United States began to dramatically step up defenses against nuclear attack. Medium-range jet bombers represented the best line of defense.
Right at the time of Sputnik, the only weapon systems that we had that could really threaten the Russian heartland were our strategic bomber fleet. And so there was a great deal of emphasis upon expanding our strategic bomber fleet and putting them on 24/7, round-the-clock alert to ward off an ICBM strike on the United States coming from Russia.
To avoid surprise disaster, some of our aircraft must always be in the sky or on the alert. carrying nuclear weapons.
We had to keep so many aircraft on alert status at all times to be able to take off at a minute's notice, fully loaded. We had these aircraft at our base. All the SAC bases had aircraft on immediate alert status, and we kept aircraft ferrying back and forth TDY, temporary duty status, to bases all over Europe.
Soon, this deadly game of nuclear brinksmanship would forever change the lives of one South Carolina family and hurl the tiny community of Mars Bluff onto the front pages of newspapers around the world. Keeping a fleet of nuclear bombers in the sky night and day was no small task. The Air Force and Strategic Air Command considered training, and lots of it, critical to their mission.
All we did was train, everything. We were ready for it because we knew it was coming. We expected it to come at any minute, and we had to be ready for it.
In the Air Force, they trained very, very seriously. And every exercise that they had would have certain parameters that were like, were the bombs delivered on time? Did all the planes take off? Was everything on schedule? Or they, of course, didn't drop bombs. They used electronic signals.
In the early morning hours of March 11, 1958, the crew of a United States Air Force B-47E medium-range bomber stationed at Hunter Air Force Base in Savannah, Georgia, readied themselves for what they expected would be a very long day.
We had about 48 B-47s there. They were medium jet bombers, and they could barely cross the Atlantic, but with refueling, they could fly almost forever. And they were targeted against, generally speaking, Soviet targets. And they were part of the Airborne Alert Program, where there was always at least one or more nuclear-armed jet bombers aloft at any moment of the day or night.
The two pilots, Captain Earl Keeler and Captain Charles Woodruff, along with Captain Bruce Kulka, the navigator, were preparing to take part in a critical simulated combat mission and special weapons exercise called Operation Snow Flurry. Their B-47 was designated Garfield 13.
The crew arrived about 8 o'clock in the morning, and they had a long day. They had to check the aircraft. They had to go through pre-flight briefings on the route and their training target on the way. They had to check the aircraft externally and internally, and they had to have briefings by weather and intelligence people.
Their work was cut out for them. The crew of Garfield 13, along with 3 additional bombers, would transport a nuclear weapon from Hunter Air Force Base all the way to Bruntingthorpe Air Base in England. Because of the limited range of the B-47, they would have to refuel in midair off the coast of Canada. While they were at it, they would make a practice bombing run over England.
We had to load this aircraft at 8 o'clock in the morning and get it pre-flighted, get it signed off, so the air crew could have the aircraft to do their work and their pre-flight for about a 3:15 p.m. takeoff that day. We finished loading the weapon in the aircraft, and I inspected the aircraft and signed off on everything, and we closed the bomb bay doors about 10:15 that morning.
As it turned out, the day would be much longer for the crew of Garfield 13 and for the rural community of Mars Bluff, South Carolina. On a B-47, a nuclear weapon was held in place by a mechanism that would allow it to be released by the crew. A steel locking pin was also used as a failsafe against accidental release. Theoretically, the pin would only be removed in the event of an actual mission against the Soviet Union. With the pin in place, the weapon wasn't going anywhere. Regulations dictated that on takeoff and landing, the pin would be removed so that the bomb could be released if the aircraft ran into trouble.
This will lighten the aircraft and make it easier to fly and increase their chances of survivability.
When the bomber reached cruising altitude, the crew realized that something was wrong.
There's a light in the cockpit, and if the light is red, that means everything is okay. If the light is out, that means either the light is burned out or something bad has happened.
In the case of Garfield 13, something bad had happened. The steel pin would not slide back into the lock position. The bomb was not secure.
The co-pilot pulled the system to get the pin to reseat, and it never would do that.
After several failed attempts, the captain ordered the navigator into the bomb bay to try and get the pin back into place manually.
He did not know the precise geometry of the entire system and how it worked, but the bomb was very large and he was quite short. And he felt around, and he had a flashlight, and he had his oxygen mask on, and he wasn't quite sure what was happening. And he thought, aha, after a while he figured, aha, it's up there on top of the bomb. The bomb's large and has a big curve in it, and he was short. So he needed to raise himself up to get better access, and he needed to get a handhold. So he jumped up and grabbed a wire, which happened to be, sadly, the salvo wire. And as a result, the bomb dropped about 2 feet onto the bomb bay doors, and it rested there for a couple seconds. Then the bomb bay doors gave way, and the bomb went boom.
Right about the time the ill-fated B-47, flying out of Savannah's Hunter Air Force Base, inadvertently dropped its 7,600-pound atomic payload. It was flying over the sparsely populated community of Mars Bluff, just a few miles east of Florence. It landed about 100 yards from the family home of Walter Gregg, practically in their backyard. While the bomb's nuclear core did not detonate, the massive TNT trigger did, leaving a 35 feet deep, 70 feet wide crater. Homes and other buildings within a 5-mile radius were damaged by the blast. Unclassified Air Force documents describe the Gregg home as having sustained total property damage. Walter Gregg, his wife, Ethel May, their 3 children, and one of their friends were all home at the time. Miraculously, no one was killed.
Just prior to the airplane dropping the bomb, my 2 daughters and little cousin and the maid were out in a little play yard they had in the edge of the woods, which would have been about 50 feet from where the bomb actually landed. They were there playing, and I don't know why, they moved in to the, maybe 75 to 100 yards away from that place, and that's when the bomb hit. And my son himself was in a garage we'd built out of big heavy timbers and all, and the shrapnel from that bomb hit all around us and went through those fat laddered boards. But we were 75, 80 yards from the actual holes the bomb went in. Smoke covered the yard. You couldn't see 10, 12 feet around it because all the smoke and the dust from the trees. My left arm, I had my arm holding up, try to keep stuff from hitting my son and himself. I got a fairly good cut under this arm here. Wife was in the house. Her right side, she got a nice cut over her right ear, around a hairline all across in there.
All I can remember is that I was sewing, and then the next thing I knew, I was trying to get out of the house, and I had all this plastering and stuff to climb over and try to work my way out, and I finally got to what had been our front porch. And Bill was there yelling and telling me to come this way.
In spite of the devastating nature of the blast, only 9-year-old Ella Davies, a cousin of the Greggs, required an overnight stay in the hospital.
It blew her spleen loose. They had to take her to the hospital and have all that put back together. And the rest of the children wasn't seriously hurt, other than the brains all shook up.
Within a few short hours, what seemed like the entire world descended upon Mars Bluff.
An atomic bomb breaks loose from a mounting shackle in a B-47 jet over Florence, South Carolina, plummets to Earth, causing a sensational freak accident. There was near disaster for those within range of the TNT, that is the bomb's trigger, 6 were injured. The home of Walter Gregg was turned into a shambles.
The United States Air Force had just dropped a nuclear bomb on an American family, and the world was riveted. Newspapers from as far away as Greece and Turkey covered the story, but it was the Florence Morning News that got there first, and they led the way.
Their coverage was excellent. It had lots of photographs, and it had a lot of stories, and they certainly scooped the New York Times by quite a bit.
We started getting phone calls from newspapers all over the country, and then finally European, and I remember talking to somebody from a Sydney, Australian newspaper that was calling looking for local details. But we were all of a sudden really on the map. A lot of people came in, and television was fairly new around here then, but the television people and radio people turned up, and newspaper people, wire service people. And a lot of them came to the morning news. It served sort of as a base for them.
For the United States, dropping a 7,600-pound atomic bomb on a residential area was a public relations nightmare. Moscow radio reported that an incident like the one that occurred over Mars Bluff could lead to the all-out nuclear war that the world hoped would never come. U.S. allies didn't feel much better.
The accident that occurred in South Carolina not only scared the Soviet Union, it also sent a real shockwave through our allies, because we had the very same planes with the very same weapons on them based out of England and out of other bases in Europe and in Asia. And so this frightened those nations a great deal.
The commander of Hunter Air Force Base quickly traveled to Florence, and on the day after the explosion, issued a public apology. On behalf of the United States Air Force and the Strategic Air Command, I want to express our regret concerning the accidental drop of an unarmed nuclear weapon near the city of Florence. Our investigating team has thoroughly surveyed the area, and I can assure you that there is no danger of radioactive contamination. Major General Charles B. Dower, March 12, 1958. But not everyone was convinced.
When the general got there, he told several people that were actually walking down in the crater, and this was steaming mud, now it wasn't just sitting there, that they should go home and bathe and burn their clothes, that they may have been exposed to radiation.
There were some press releases that said radiation had been released, but surprisingly, the press did not follow up on that. And as it turned out, the classified radiation studies that were done years after the incident proved that, in fact, there was no substantial radiation that did leak.
The plutonium core of this weapon wasn't in the device when it fell. Uranium, though, would have been part of the housing and wouldn't necessarily have been part of that core capsule that wasn't present that day. The consequences from that, as far as a radiological hazard, are insignificant, really. Uranium is ever present in our soil and rock, and so we're exposed to it constantly.
While the Air Force put their spin on the accident and the international press continued its coverage, Walter Gregg and his family were as good-spirited as any family could expect to be, considering everything they owned had been blown up by an atomic bomb. They lived off the generosity of neighbors and family and waited patiently for the compensation that was surely coming their way.
Now, Winston Filter Cigarettes bring you America's #1 panel show, I've Got a Secret, starring Gary Moore.
Gary Moore's show, they called and we made arrangements with them, go up on train one night and stay a couple of days up there and then come back.
You read about these folks in every newspaper, every news magazine, every newsreel. This is the family from Florence, South Carolina, who miraculously escaped injury when their house was hit by an atom bomb on March 11th. What has the government offered any remuneration?
They are estimating damages and will rebuild when
they'll take care of all your bills.
After you get through with all of it.
Well, these are perilous times in which we live. What is your viewpoint toward that, sir? Do you feel resentment? Are you angry about it?
No. I think bombs are a good thing to have, just to use them in proper places.
Here's the money. Here are 2 cartons of Winston's for the grown-ups. And Greg's, thank you all very much for sharing your time.
The $80 and 2 cartons of cigarettes that the Greggs walked away with that night were fairly easy to come by. But getting reasonable compensation from the United States Air Force would prove to be much more difficult.
We were getting right tired of the whole deal. So nobody would come across with anything or tell you anything.
To start, the Air Force wanted a complete inventory of everything that had been destroyed.
It's impossible. There's no one, I don't believe, could sit down and tell you everything they had in their house. Furniture, china, crystal, silverware, clothes, lamps, everything. I don't believe anybody could do it, but I was supposed to do it.
But the Air Force didn't intend to pay the Greggs the full replacement value for what they themselves described as total property damage.
The Air Force didn't really rise to the occasion. In those days, their way of paying claims was to use straight line depreciation. In other words, if you had a pair of pants and the estimated lifetime of your pants was 3 years and you'd worn it for 2 years, they would give you 1/3 of the value.
Representative John McMillan and Senator Strom Thurmond both sponsored emergency legislation to raise the limitation on claims the Air Force could settle in the field from $1,000 to $5,000. And while the increase certainly helped the residents of Mars Bluff who sustained relatively minor damage, like broken windows and cracked walls, the Greggs lost everything they owned. And $5,000 wasn't going to come close to making up for that. With bills mounting, Walter Gregg did what any rational person would do under similar circumstances. He hired an attorney.
The Greggs, I think, were very properly right in thinking that there wasn't a proper match between the attitudes and the very values of the government appraisers and the Greggs and their personal losses. They were just as torn up as the ground around their home.
Eventually, the Greggs did receive some compensation, but for everything they endured and for all of their losses, the wounds have never healed.
There was 2 years and 2 lawsuits before they ever paid us for the first money. And when they paid us, everybody's claim was put in ours.
March of 2008 marked the 50th anniversary of the incident at Mars Bluff. Over the years, curiosity seekers from all over the country have come to Mars Bluff for a look at the bomb's crater.
They would hear about the bomb from somewhere, read something, or heard something. They would come up, knock on the door, and I never knew who they were, and they'd say, I'm such and such a name, and I heard a bomb fell close by. Could we see the crater site?
In early 2009, a ceremony was held in Mars Bluff to unveil the marker commemorating the historic blunder. For Bill Gregg and his wife Effie, the occasion was bittersweet. Until recently, they'd been reluctant to discuss that day in 1958.
I think one reason I didn't talk, we had so much less now than we had then. And maybe it made me a little, maybe it hurt enough I just couldn't talk about it.
I don't feel the Greggs got a fair shake over the deal. I think after the press died down after a month or so, I think the Air Force personnel were ill-trained and very insensitive to their needs. They were made to feel un-American by not being appreciative of being the victims of this accident, and in my mind, they are victims.
Actually, they treated us like a bunch of criminals. We didn't have anything to do with it. They started off in Savannah with it, came up and dropped it, and that left us with nothing.
Maybe it's been enough time that I'm just ready to finally accept it.